Hello, I'm Close Alhani, and this is This Week in Focus. Welcome to This Week in Focus. And today we have a very special person with us from Brussels, Amanda Paul, who is Senior Policy Analyst at the European Policy Centre. Amanda, thank you very much for being with us today.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me.
We're living in turbulent times with strange things happening and dangerous things happening. What is your opinion about Turkey and namely NATO? Is NATO likely to help Turkey in case of need?
Well, hopefully we will come to that juncture. If you're talking about the recent downing of the Russian aircraft in Turkish airspace, I think it's clear that the reaction of NATO has been to support their ally Turkey, that the aircraft in Turkish airspace and saying the absolute risk. But apart from this, they've made it rather clear that this is principally a bilateral issue between Turkey and the Russian Federation. And I think this reflects the situation in Syria, where there's still hope for, let's say, a broader cooperation in the fight against ISIS. So I don't think we're going to see NATO as an organisation dragged into this bilateral drift between Turkey and Russia.
Was it established, was it confirmed that the plane was in Turkish airspace?
Well, I think it's clear from the radar pictures that the Turkish authorities immediately released that it was in Turkish airspace. And let's be honest, the Russians can be extremely economical with the truth, as we've seen in Ukraine. So it comes as no surprise to me that they would say, oh, no, it wasn't in Turkish airspace, it was in Syria. And again, it comes after several other violations by the Russian Federation into Turkish airspace, which were clearly, a show of power, which is again a typical policy of President Putin. Let's push against NATO's eastern flank, which is Turkey. But I guess the Russians weren't expecting Turkey to respond militarily, which again shows that Turkey responded to this also with a show of power.
Do you think Europe will be able to create a united front with Russia to combat the threat posed by ISIS?
Already before this incident, they weren't on the brink of having a united front. And this goes back to the fact that the Russian position regarding the future of President Assad is very different to the West. The Russians would like to see him remain there in some shape or form in the future. The West don't agree with that. Also, there's, obviously a conflict over what Russia is actually doing in Syria, because despite the fact the Russians say they are primarily targeting ISIS, and they are targeting ISIS, still the majority of time has been spent targeting other groups on the ground, opposition groups that are supported by the West, which is clearly still, a thorn in coming to some agreement regarding a broader international operation there.
And also targeting some of the Chechens, the Turkmen and other groups that are closer to Russia geographically.
Well, exactly. They're targeting everybody that is a threat either to the Russians or a threat to Assad. But clearly the terrorist attacks in Paris have changed the picture slightly, because we've seen an outreach from President Hollande to Russian President Putin to try and draw Russia in and bring Russia in from the cold.
Yes. Do you think this is likely to create an economic crisis in Russia to begin with? War is expensive, as we know, and the drain on Russia, already with the oil being cheaper and cheaper, that's hurting. And now with his involvement in Syria, in a what is a full-fledged war practically, do you think it's going to hurt him economically?
Well, Russia's already hurting economically. But the policy of Putin is that strategic objectives outweigh, economic considerations. And the Russian population, as we've seen historically, are ready to bear quite a lot of economic pain if it's for the pride of their nation or they think their national interests are at stake. I don't think Russia is about to go bankrupt, because Putin is a very innovative man. He manages to find a way to get by, to find money from here and there, to scrape new deals. But of course, the operation in Syria, is costing the Russians billions. But they always seem to have enough money left in the bank, and they do still have significant reserves from years gone by. But these won't last forever. I'm guessing the Russians are hoping that in the shorter term, sanctions will be lifted from vis-a-vis Ukraine as a response to cooperation in Syria against terrorist threats.
Do you think Washington is trying to repeat history by having the Russians overspend on the military to bankrupt them?
Well, actually, I think that would be the worst thing that could happen. We don't want to bankrupt Russia, because the implications of that could be far far worse than President Putin's regional policy. It would spill out into Europe, but also it could have an explosive effect internally in Russia, which could actually see the Russian Federation combust and disintegrate to a certain degree.
I agree with you. I agree with you 100%. But do the people in Washington see it the same way? That's always the danger, is that the Americans seem to be engaged in a policy that is not always the sane policy.
Well, I mean, it's true. Sometimes, people in Washington seem to be looking at a completely different picture to what the people in the region are looking at. But I do think they have taken on board, or they do recognise what would be the implications of a bankrupt Russia. I don't think they're so short-sighted that they wouldn't see that.
What if you had to take a wild guess at how things are likely to span out? How do you see the Syrian crisis unfolding?
Well, I mean, it's clear until you get proper regional cooperation. I mean, let's put Russia, aside for a moment. I mean, Russia's obviously a key player, but two of the, key players also in this process are Iran and Saudi Arabia. And until you can get these two countries working together rather than focusing on undermining each other because of the Sunni Shia issue, there's never going to be a problem. I mean, Iran has been supporting the Assad regime since the first day that he was, let's say, ran away from office. In fact, they've been playing a much stronger role in supporting Assad than Russia ever has. So not only do you need an international cooperation from the big external players, you also need to have, those countries on the ground in the region, Sunni and Shia, focusing on this issue. Because at the end of the day, ISIS are saying they're doing this in the name of, Allah or in God, that they're Muslims. So it's, in a way, it's down to Muslims themselves, particularly, Sunni Muslims, to actually push back and show that they don't accept this version of Islam and that they do not want an organization like ISIS on their territory. And so far, this hasn't happened.
Why is it that the Muslims can't address this problem? Well, I mean, they should be fighting ISIS more than anybody else, but they're not. It's the Russians, it's the Americans, it's the British, it's the French, and the Turks to some extent.
Well, I mean, in the case of Iran and Saudi Arabia, it's about power and control of this region. Neither one wants it to fall into the other one's hands because they both fear what that could mean, for their own sect of Islam, first of all, but also what it would mean for their own relations and their own power trajectory over the region and their relations, particularly with the United States. I mean, Saudi Arabia clearly fear a return of warm ties between the United States and Iran, because we all know in the past when the US had good ties with the Shah, Iran was basically the regional policeman. And this is what the Saudis talk about today. I mean, I don't think this is happening, and this is a gross exaggeration. But until, these two power projecting powers are able to find some sort of way to compromise, there's always going to be turmoil in this region.
That's not very reassuring to think that there'll always be turmoil in the region. I have been covering this region for a good part of 40 years, and I've never seen it that turbulent, that dangerous, that explosive.
Well, I mean, the fact is, whether we like it or not, I mean, the Arab Spring got rid of leaders who managed to rule the region, with an iron fist. Mubarak, Assad, Saddam Hussein. When the United States went into Iraq, first of all, this changed the whole picture on the ground, and it created a huge security vacuum. And this opened the way for Al-Qaeda and then ISIS to enter into the theatre of the Middle East. The United States was seen as supporting Shia at the cost of Sunni. And this kicked off the whole, let's say, entry of, let's say, a greater level of terrorism. All the security structures that were in place that cracked down on radical jihadism under Hussein, under Assad, etc., were torn apart. All these people were fired and new people came in, new political movements, political Islam. So you have an extremely tense and volatile situation on the ground. And frankly speaking, I don't think the United States has really any clue whatsoever of how to resolve it. And probably they won't be able to resolve it, because generally when West gets involved, things get more messy than they ever were before.
That is absolutely true. I think the more you look at it, the messier it gets. And how do we get out of this crisis? What would you do?
Well, I mean, the problem with ISIS, I mean, okay, we need to strike ISIS on the ground. As I said, I think they should be done more by the regional players than the West. I mean, I think it would be a gross mistake to put boots on the ground from any European nation, let alone the United States. But we also need to address the issue of radicalisation and where jihadism comes from in Europe as well. I mean, this means paying more attention to Islamic groups that are financed by, the Gulf states in Europe, paying more attention to what goes on in schools and universities in terms of radicalisation, young people, putting more, let's say, different representatives into Islamic communities who people could turn to for support or to cite when they see that something serious is going on or something strange. So it needs to be a two-pronged approach.
Absolutely. I think there needs to be something else added. There needs to be a sort of Marshall Plan to help these countries get out of the crisis and achieve something positive. Otherwise, they'll keep coming across to Europe, and we'll have...
But I mean, the problem is, I'm coming from Belgium. Belgium's been locked down over the weekend while the Belgian police and security forces searched out for jihadists. But this is something that's been going on in Belgium for years. For the last 4 or 5 years, and even long before that, you had foreign fighters travelling to Syria, and this was well known. And there was just, insufficient measures or pretty much nothing done by the Belgian authorities for many years to crack down on it. And you can even go back to Afghanistan. There was foreign fighters from Belgium going. So you've had a lot of terrorist cells that have just been left to breed, and there hasn't been enough, anti-terrorism measures and the finance, etc., put into this.
Why is that? Why do they ignore this problem?
In Belgium, to a certain degree, it's a lack of, cooperation between the different security units in the country, because it's like a country that has more than one police force, more than one intelligence service, because it's split into, Flemish and French-speaking cantons. Or perhaps the threat just wasn't taken seriously enough, because at the end of the day, the biggest challenge from ISIS is actually the idea of ISIS, the ideology of ISIS, not striking it militarily. Of course, we can beat them militarily, and at the end of the day, there are only a few thousand on the ground. We have some of the world's biggest armies, but if you don't get rid of the ideology or change the way people see ISIS, this problem isn't going to go away at all. It's just going to get actually worse and more, embedded.
Yeah, it's amazing that they ignored it like that. I wrote a story in January of this year saying, according to Belgian intelligence sources and French intelligence sources, that there were about 1,000 jihadists in Belgium.
Yeah, I think there is probably at least 1,000. At least 400. There's been at least 400 foreign fighters that have gone to Syria and come back. If you consider how small Belgium is, this is a significant number. It's probably one of the highest in the world in terms of foreign fighters per capita. But there just wasn't enough focus put on it. It wasn't giving enough of serious attention. If you remember Barack Obama's original comments about ISIS, he almost brushed them under the carpet and said they weren't really a serious threat. And now, a couple of years later, it's the biggest security threat we're actually facing.
Thank you for being with us today. It's been an interesting discussion with Amanda Paul from Brussels, who's given us an overview of the situation in the world, which is very precarious today. The only thing I can say is I leave you with hopes for a better tomorrow.